as we have folks still joining, I'm just going to make a few announcements. First of all, welcome to everybody. Really appreciate you being here for this session. We will be recording this session and it will be available in Huba, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you would like to ask any of your speakers a question during their session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. This is also where you'll find the chat where you can engage with your speakers as well as other attendees. And finally, I would like to ask that you all keep your microphones and your cameras off during the presentation and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and or your microphones being on. Well, that is all I have. We are at our start time, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Alina.
Hi, folks. Welcome everyone back from break. Hopefully you had time to grab a cup of coffee or something like that. We are in our last block of a 3-section high-resolution remote sensing talk. And we're going to have 3 talks right now, and then we will finish off with a 40-minute discussion section with the speakers and presenters. We've increased in scale over the course of this session from fine resolution field modeling, and we're going to be moving up to landscape scales at the end of this talk. Next up is Chris Moran, and he's going to talk about using unmanned UAS for a prescribed fire experiment. Go ahead, Chris, and take it away.
Hello, my name is Chris Moran, and I'm coming to you from the University of Montana from what is known as a light board room. And I'll be talking about pattern process interactions, fuel treatment, prescribed fire experiment, utilizing uncrewed aerial systems or drones, and thermal imagery. And we've been doing this kind of data collection for several years now. The basic premise is you have a drone overhead with a long wave thermal sensor, and it's measuring fire as it sweeps underneath. Usually working at 120 to 140 meters in altitude. That gives you about a hectare footprint of what you can see, and we've been utilizing hectare plots. But the pandemic has really shut down a lot of our burning, so these experiments I'll be talking about today is really a result of the inability to go to our larger scale burns. So we, at our properties here at the University of Montana, have been burning really small burns, small complements of people, and looking at some targeted experiments. Before I get into all that, just a quick conceptual framework of what I'm trying to develop here is developing sets of experiments that isolate certain factors. And today specifically, we're going to look at a fuel change and the result of fire behavior. Those experiments, getting observational data, recreating the similar type experiments within CFD, the next gen CFD fire models. For today, we'll be looking at WFDS. So we can both, using those observational data, we can validate the models themselves, and also more importantly is we can generate new hypotheses from the models by varying different input parameters. You know, what happens if you double the wind speed? What if you cut it in half? What if you double the moisture content? Things like that, stuff that is very hard, those variables that are very hard to vary within the field. Do that within the models, which then generate hypotheses that can inform another set of prescribed fire experiments. Ultimately, to understand the causes and consequences of pattern. So we call this the crop circles experiment, and that'll be apparent here in another slide why that is. But like I mentioned, we're trying to characterize the relationship between field pattern and fire behavior, and the way to do that is really trying to, within the field, you've got a very complex fire environment, trying to minimize all those confounding variables so you can isolate that fuel and fire behavior relationship. And one way to do that is get rid of a lot of the remote sensing problems with fuels. So we have known locations. We're going out making modifications to the fuels. Those are the crop circles. Know exactly what they are, what was done to them, and then a statistical design of plots and control pairings that create the ability to do pairwise comparisons and generate within a burn lots of replications so you can start looking at things like central tendency. And then objective 2, like I mentioned, we're developing data to inform, validate, and compare to CFD-based fire models. So here, this is the 2021 burn. We've done 2 of these now, one in 2020, one in 2021. Randomly placing circles out there, that is 3.66 meters in diameter, cutting the fuels down to 4 to 6 inches in height, leaving the fuels within it. So it's really here we're implementing a change in arrangement. An add-on to 2021, if you notice these brown circles out there, those are actually needles. So changing the fuel type in some of the circles, and we know the exact mass of what we're putting in there, and we collected what didn't consume afterwards, so we can get specific estimates of mass loss within those specific circles. Yeah, that's the 2021. Most of the data I'll be talking about today, all of it, is the 2020 burn. And here's an ortho mosaic of that and the plot placement. Here's the basic design. You've got a control circle, and then outside, immediately a donut ring of equal area outside is the control, with the idea that things like change in wind direction, changes in wind speed, differences in fuels across the unit, all that is minimized by looking at the area directly outside. So ideally the fire inside and outside is experiencing the same general fire environment. I mentioned we place these circles randomly, but we also adjusted if there was any kind of fuel change within the circle or immediately around in the control area. So we kind of shifted those around so we could be working with the assumption that the fuels, before treatment at least, the fuels were consistent in the control and in the actual plot. We used a factor variable of fuel class here, and that is because we cut everything. The treatment itself was all done the same way. It's cut to the same height, fuel's left in it. But if you have more starting fuel, then the degree of change inside versus outside, inside the plot versus the control, is different. So we want to control for that by classifying these fuels. So there's the design. Actually got to go out and burn it, and this is a big advantage of the University of Montana, is we have properties that we can burn, that we can experiment on. The National Center for Landscape Fire Analysis, we all have red cards and the know-how to burn, and we can also get people who are not necessarily experienced in fire out there. This is Anthony Marcosi, a computer science master's student out there lighting some fire. So big advantage that we have at the university is we can do things like this and incorporate people not necessarily who have the fire background. We can incorporate them into our burning. So here's a post-fire image of the 2021 burn. 2 reasons I show this. One, these small-scale burns are easily implementable. We just had 2 trucks out there, one with water, and I think 7 people out there on this burn. Not much red tape to deal with, so it's actually really refreshing when you're used to dealing with big multi-organizational burns with lots of people. Just being able to get out there, less stress, and get the burns done. Really enjoyable. The other reason I show this is those 9 plots that had needles, clear difference in the ash fraction there. So we've got some ideas of looking at post-fire effects, not only pre-fire fuels and fire behavior, but also integrating some possibilities of some post-fire effect as well. So some actual results from that 2020 burn. So we get 35 plots of the treated area and then the control around it. We're quantifying things like fire radiative energy density, which is an integration of fire radiative flux density, and then also looking at things like fire progression. You can also just look, we also have a MicaSense radiometric RGB camera on our drones, so we can just look at some RGB images of what the flames were looking like. Big result here that we saw in 22 out of the 35 plots. We saw what's known as a junction fire develop on the downwind side of the fuel treatment. And a junction fire is just a simple V-shaped fire line geometry, also called chevrons. But there's a lot of experimental and laboratory studies looking at this chevron shape. They're showing that it's not only the geometry, but there's also convective and radiative processes going on that cause a strong acceleration in the rate of spread from this vertex point. So we saw this form in 22 of our 35 plots, and we are also seeing the resulting acceleration. So really cool fuel pattern process interaction there. Here is all 35 of those plots, so you do get replication. I thought about doing my entire talk just with this slide, but then I realized I'm not great at this, so there's no way I could be able to get through this without the help of other slides. But several things here to mention. One, this is the reason you want to use circles, is look at all these different directions that the fire was hitting these plots. Also the different rates of spread. Each one of these is the sequence of when the fire hit the plot and then when it exited. So if it took longer, it's going to go slower, like this one. If it moved really fast, it's going to do this. But really speaks to that variability that you can see out there. And this is a way to get replication. You've got plots, controls, get some replication within a prescribed fire. And I mentioned that junction fire in 22 of the 35. It's actually really hard if you've been trying to see that V-shaped form. It's really hard to see that form because it's really a fleeting geometry that occurs in these, in that the fire almost within 5 to 10 seconds, most cases, reforms, engulfs, and you're really hard to tell that it even hit a fuel change at all, any kind of variability. So that's one of the big results. Once you synthesize all that data, we're looking at radiative energy on the left here, and then rate of spread. I'll talk about rate of spread here first. So we quantified rate of spread within the plot, within the exact extent of the plot, and then also looked through the plot over a longer time period, in most cases about 15 seconds. So we looked at the average rate of spread as it moved through the plots and then the next 15 seconds, and that's where this design of plot control is really nice. You can we difference through the plot and the control and saw no difference in the rate of spread due to treatment. There is a difference immediately within the plot. So basically fire hits it, it slows down, and then accelerates beyond what the control was doing in order to catch up. And then that you get no difference in the fire line. Is largely, just anecdotally, largely reformed, and it's hard to tell anything really happened just seconds after it exits the plot. So that's the rate of spread. Energy-wise, so here I forgot to mention, the yellow is moderate fuel class, red is heavy fuel class. Didn't look at rate of spread in the light because the fire actually stopped in 2 of the 3 plots in the light fuel class. But looking at just energy within the plot versus control, on average we get a 15% increase in the control, total radiative output, versus the plot. When you so known expected differences I should mention here between light, moderate, heavy. Of course, energy goes up as you have more fuel loading, but those difference between the control and the plot were the same, even though we knew the degree of change in arrangement was larger in the heavy fuel class compared to light. So it's really interesting is that difference. There was no significant difference in that difference, pairwise difference by fuel class. Looking at just control and plot, like I mentioned, there's a 15% increase in the control. So cool results, localized difference in energy, but no real difference, no lasting difference in or effect on the fire itself. So back to that framework, we've got experiment implemented, we've got some data. Now I'm going to quickly talk just about some basic results we're getting out of the fire models, really preliminary, but interesting. So I mentioned we're using that WFDS model. There's simplifications of that called level sets. Here's level set 4, and then the full physics run here. Really simple runs, just small domain. The only difference is you get a little circle. The green areas that fuel changes, same changes as our crop circle. Same parameters. Very interesting, you get inverted results here. Level set 4 shows that chevron develop, which is a function in the model, just a difference in rate of spread between the control and inside. Full FDS, you actually got an acceleration within it, which create this convex shape rather than a concave shape here. Still trying to figure out what happened, the exact mechanisms within the models. We know this does interactions better. This is pretty basic as far as what it's trying to do as far as rate of spread. But not necessarily wrong, because we can find comparable observations just within this 35 plots that at least at some time step and scale match what we're seeing in the models. This one, of course, is moving really fast, but you do get a nice chevron that develops. This doesn't handle what happens afterwards at all. Really, in this model, that chevron develops and then it just stays the whole way. You go this, and then it just goes all the way to the end of the domain. It looks the same. So doesn't get the downwind effects, but it does get the development of the chevron largely right. Full FDS, not what we saw in the vast majority of plots, but there are a few that you do get that convex shape and an actual acceleration within the plot versus the control. And if you watch this a few times, you've got issues with flanking. So not a one-to-one match by any means, but interesting nonetheless that with a treatment, even in one prescribed fire, you can get the opposite effects, both observationally, and then depending on the models you're using, can get the same thing. So looking forward, eventually want to utilize all of our 3D fuels and forest structure data that we've been collecting, start looking at scaling effects, both in how, what kind of scale you're quantifying your fuels at, either raster, 2D, or 3D. And then fire behavior-wise, I mentioned heat per unit area, comparing those to our measured mass loss in those needle plots. So we have a precise validation point on the ground using mass loss. We compare that to our HBA from the thermal imagery. And then this feedback loop that I mentioned, that we're getting experiments, developing them in the models as well, in order to validate, to mechanistically deconstruct, to say like, oh, it's convective or radiative heat transfer that's driving, say, that chevron development. You can get that out of the models. Hard to really measure that. We only can look at the radiative fraction in our designs. but then extrapolating, changing the parameters within the model, creating hypotheses that then inform a new set of experimental design parameters. So that's all I have today. This is part of a larger CERTUP grant. A lot of collaborators in that. This one itself has largely just been a University of Montana and a Missoula Fire Lab experiment. The National Center for Landscape Fire Analysis, Carl Lloyd Valentine Maggie. Then we've got the computer science, the University of Montana department, computer science department, Anthony Marcosi, Jesse Johnson, and then our colleagues Russ Parsons and Sarah Flannery at the Missoula Fire Lab.
Chris, thanks for the excellent presentation. We are not going to have a lot of time for questions now, although I definitely appreciated the landscape ecology perspective that was taken in that experiment. We're going to move on to Saba Saberi, and we will have a discussion section after Saba and Jonathan talk. Saba, go ahead.
Can you all see my screen? Let me.
Yes, but I don't see presentation mode. I see you need to flip them. There you go.
Cool. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Saba Saberi, and I am a research scientist in Van Kane's Forest Resilience Lab here at the University of Washington in Seattle. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we have done, that I myself have done and other folks in the lab have done over the past couple of years regarding Washington State's digital aerial photogrammetry, or DAP, data products to look at forest structure change. And so before I go into everything, I'll give you a little bit of a roadmap for this talk. What I'm going to talk about is first give you a little bit of an overview of how photogrammetry works, talk about the challenges that there are with this type of data. I'm going to compare DAP to lidar as truth because our lab primarily works with lidar and we're confident in its accuracy, so we're using it as truth. I'll go over what DAP can be used for accurately, and then I'll also kind of walk through some initial validations of DAP and how it can assess change, specifically with looking at post-fire forest structure change. And at the very end, kind of give you a hint at the future work I will be doing, because this is kind of really like the first half of this project. So a little bit of context. If you attended Gina Kova's talk yesterday, there's a lot of different ways to use photogrammetry. You can get imagery from a GoPro, you can use a drone, but in this specific case, we're talking about photogrammetry as there's a camera on board an aircraft. And we're specifically talking about Washington State's statewide lidar-like metrics that are derived from DAP. And it is not just our lab's effort, but a joint effort with DNR, Department of Natural Resources of Washington State. But photogrammetry expert Caleb Mackey is actually the person who has been taking the raw data, running it through this photogrammetry software, and basically handing it us to use. And it is a little bit of a compromised product in that it is coming from the Hexagon imagery program, which is responsible for producing NAPE imagery every 2 years. So the reason that we're interested in this is because it's a far cheaper alternative to lidar, which you have to pay for a flight, versus this is, I believe you can just pay an extra fee for the DAP products, and it's coming out of the NAPE program technically, and it's coming every 2 years, and it's coming at a 40 centimeter resolution, which is a little bit better than the 60 centimeter resolution that NAPE itself comes from. And Washington State isn't the only state that's trying to look at DAP as like a good data alternative for forest structure or just forest monitoring in general. I know Arizona and Oregon are also doing so. And specifically for this talk, we want to evaluate the data product in the context of monitoring the fires. So what exactly is DAP? The way that the data itself is produced is you've got this aircraft flying in these straight lines, taking overlapping images. There's a single push broom sensor. And the way that it works is that if you know where the aircraft is, you can basically triangulate and produce observation, you can produce XYZ measurements for the objects in the photos. So when you've already flown the imagery and you're back in the lab using this software, in the image matching process, you can get point clouds that are similar to lidar point clouds and produce digital surface models. So those are the two most important, basically, byproducts of this image matching process that comes out of this. And so that's really all you need to do. It's actually super complicated in terms of the raw image processing, but that's not really the point of the talk today. And so before I go into things, I just want to give you a quick look at where we're talking about specifically. We are looking at the Colville National Forest in northeastern Washington state, and it's kind of divided into these two little regions here. And there's one portion on the map is filled in, and that's because that's the CFLRP, and that is what we have been granted to look at and analyze. So this is the part of the world that I'm talking about during this talk. Now I'm going to transition into this lidar as truth versus DAP point clouds. The first thing that's really important to notice when you're comparing the two is that lidar point clouds are a lot richer and a lot denser. They pierce through the canopy, and you can see that from this yellow point clouds here. That's the lidar, versus the DAP is actually only showing us the top of the canopy. It can't penetrate through the way that DAP can, the way that lidar can, and that's, you know, an artifact of the fact that this is lower resolution data. So it's really good at looking at the top of the canopy. And we didn't just do visual analysis to see, you know, how does DAP compare to lidar. We did actually compare between a handful of metrics that come out of both lidar and DAP, and the one that kind of has the most easy to translate one-to-one relationship, as you can see by this best fit line here, is P95. Now, what is P95? It's a statistical measure of the point cloud, and it refers to the 95th percentile of the height points. Functionally, it's the approximate dominant tree height. So if you had dominant tree height from lidar and you had dominant tree height from DAP, they're pretty much going to have a nice close relationship, and you can feel good about using DAP-derived dominant canopy height. I know I'm talking about a lot of caveats to this data, but I still want to be clear that it is useful in determining change. In this upper left-hand corner, you can see that this is a control plot from the long-term monitoring plot that Eric Churchill started, I believe, in like 2013 or 2014. That's a control plot. No treatments have been done. And this is before and after 2015, 2019. Well, there is no before, but still. Imagery, DAP imagery of this treatment plot. And you can see that there is no change in the control plot. You can see the red, the higher, darker colors refer to higher points, and lighter colors refer to lower points. However, if you go ahead and look at the treatment plot here on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that there has been some thinning. There aren't as many trees as there were previously. So just again, quick visual check, you can determine change. Matter is at what, if you're trying to look at it really fine scale, you might get different answers. Now, the most important, I think, known issue to anyone who's going to be potentially using this DAP product in Washington State needs to know about is the fact that it does not perform as well in low canopy cover instances. And this is because the imagery that's actually used, the imagery that's taken is designed for ortho imagery, and the software that we're using to process the data is designed for ground models. Therefore, the algorithm that is used, it's trying to find the ground. And if you're trying to find the ground, you're going to pull things down. In this case, sort of like the lower right-hand corner, if there's not a lot of canopy cover and you've got this isolated clump of trees, that height's going to get pulled down. And this is just something that, you know, we can't really do anything about, but it's good to know that in low canopy cover areas, it's not doing as well. This is a graph kind of showing you that same concept that I described, in that I'm comparing LiDAR-derived max heights of trees versus DAP-derived max heights of trees. And each graph, each figure is binned by 25% of canopy cover. So on the leftmost, you've got 0 to 25% canopy cover, and as you're going towards the right, you get increased. And as you can see on the left-hand side, we've actually got the weakest relationship. And as you increase the canopy cover, the two are more related in that one-to-one relationship. And again, this is because of what I just talked about, in that the software is trying to find the ground, especially if you're in a low canopy cover area. It's thinking to itself, oh, these are actually just the ground, let me squash them down. So it's important to know the context of the canopy cover percentages of whatever area you're looking at, because if you've got a really low canopy cover area, this DAP product might not be as useful to you as it would be in a higher canopy cover area. This is kind of, again, pointing this a similar, it's showing you the same thing, but in a different way. This time, I'm not looking at max heights. I'm looking at lidar-derived canopy cover as a percent versus DAP-derived canopy cover as a percent. Again, the same bins. And as you can see on the left-hand side, in the lowest canopy cover, not the strongest relationship. In the middle bins, with 25 to 75% canopy cover, the two do have a stronger relationship. These colors refer to the density of the data. So red points means that there's a higher density of data, versus you can see the blue is actually just kind of individual points and fewer data points. So there are some outliers, but it's not a ton of data. And you might be wondering what's going on at the far end, the rightmost graph. This kind of shows you that the DAP does tend to oversaturate at a certain point. So if you've got, say, 90 or 85% canopy cover when you're looking at your LiDAR data, it's going to max out at 100% potentially for the DAP data. And that oversaturation can be due to, again, the fact that this is 40 centimeter resolution data, and it's really only good at looking at the top of the canopy. So it could be a side effect of just this moderate resolution data. So that being said, we do know these limitations of this data, but how can we go ahead and actually use DAP in the ways that it's useful to determine areas where forest structure has changed due to fire? And now I'm going to walk you through this kind of really neat example that we've got and that we will be analyzing further in the future. So in 2015, we're in the Colville National Forest. It's about August, and we kind of get 3 fires all within a couple weeks of each other. And we've got the Stickpin, the Renner, and the Graves Mountain. And what's cool about these fires is that each of them has a dominant severity type, as you can see from these density curves on the bottom. So the Stickpin fire is mostly high severity, and it's the biggest one. And then as you go down, you go towards the right, you've got a smaller, mostly moderate severity, and then the smallest, mostly low severity. And so it's really nice because we have 2015 DAP that was flown just after the fires had burned. And then we've got 2019 data, so 4 years after the fires have burned. So it's kind of like an initial assessment if you do CBI plots versus an extended assessment, although extended assessments and CBI are 1 year after. Anyway, so it's kind of this really nice sort of natural 3 different treatments for us to look at and use this DAP data to see, is the DAP data telling us that the forest changed due to fire? And the way that we decided to go ahead and measure this was using the fractal area index, which is a landscape ecology metric. I won't get into the math of it now, but basically all you need to know is that it can range from between 1 and 2, and it functionally tells you how much the canopy is being broken up. So if you've got a value of 1 here over on the left, it means that in this case, let's say a given pixel is fully covered by canopy, it's pretty intact. And as you go down or as you go up the numerical scale, it gets more and more broken up. So you would expect, just sort of hypothetically, if you had a pretty closed canopy and a high severity fire came through, you would go from a pretty low value of frac to a high value of frac, because you have mortality and the needles would fall off and the canopy would be broken up. And so that's just sort of one of the metrics that we decided to use, and the other one being canopy cover. So here is a nice graph where I'm looking at DAP-derived canopy cover versus DAP-derived frac for each of the fires. And all 3 of them kind of have this nice little sigmoidal relationship, albeit with varying levels of basically data variability in the width of these. I kind of think them as worms in my head. That's what I've been looking at them so long, I just call them worms. But for the Stickpin fire, you can see that the lower the canopy cover is, the higher the frac value is, which again makes sense, right? If you have lower canopy cover, it's more likely to be more broken up versus really high canopy cover. It might be more likely to be not broken up. And for each fire, there are differences in the tightness of that curve or in the variability of the data. Stickpin fire was mostly high severity. That's why it's got a tighter relationship versus as you go down to these more moderate severity, there is more variability in data. And that's often the case with any kind of burn severity work that we do, right? In the two bounds of really high severity or unburned, there's usually tighter relationships. And as you kind of go into that middle space, it does tend to have more variability. So here is a really nice just map showing exactly what I was talking about. On the left, we've got the 2015 frac. So just right after the fire, you can see that most of these areas have pretty high canopy cover. And then as you transition to looking at the area 4 years after the fire, you can see where the fire broke up the canopy. And this big, oh, you can't see my mouse, but that big yellow swath is basically where the fire was acting in the most high severity, and that's where the highest frac values are. And just a reminder of a low frac is that green square, and a high frac is that more broken up square. I also have this MTBS map on the RDMBR map on the side, because any of you who work with that and you are looking at a fire that came from the Landsat 7, you'll know that there's these dead swaths where there's no data. So sometimes you might want to be interested in looking at what's going on in those dead swaths, and that RDMBR product is not useful. And so I was thinking to myself, well, if you wanted to just do a quick visual analysis of where there might be high severity fire, looking at post-fire frac coming from DAP might be a useful way to do so. And another reason I have that map up is because the Graves Mountain fire there on the bottom came from Landsat 8, not Landsat 7, so it's actually a good RDMBR map. And just as a visual comparison, the two do look pretty similar, which again is another gut check for me that, okay, post-fire frac in this case is kind of like a nice proxy for burn severity, just at a really like high level. I went ahead and did the same thing in producing these maps just for the canopy cover. And again, it's telling the same story that, you know, before the fires, there was pretty decent high canopy cover across at least most of the area that the Stickpin fire burned in. And then after the fire, it did high severity canopy broke up. So that's all I've actually got for this talk. And the key takeaways that I want you to go home with from this are that this Washington State DAP program uses 40 centimeter stereo imagery to make point clouds and digital surface models. It's really good at sensing the top of the canopy. It's not as good in looking at the bottom of the canopy, or sorry, not the bottom of the canopy, in low canopy cover areas. And you can use metrics like frac and canopy cover to assess post-fire change. And what I will be doing basically for the next couple months is assessing change across treatments within the Colville CFLRP at multiple scales. We've actually got field data, we've got STEM maps at a really fine scale, so we can use that as truth and see what DAP is telling us about how much change has occurred. And we'll also still be doing some more analysis of these fires. This was really just a kind of preliminary talk. That being said, I'd like to acknowledge all the people from all these different groups that have helped me with this work. Astrid, Bryce, Jonathan here in the lab at UW, Bob McGoy kind of helped me out a lot on these slides. Caleb Mackey, Annie Smith, and Derek Churchill have all been really helpful in thinking through this stuff and providing the data. And the funding for this comes from both the Colville National Forest and the Department of Natural Resources at Washington State. So that's all I've got for you. And maybe we have 1 minute for questions. I need to get back into the Zoom. Cool.
Saba, thank you so much for your talk. It's great to see where this has gone since the last time I saw it. I'm checking, are there any questions from the audience at all right now? If not, we may need to move directly on to the next talk. Okay. I think we're going to go ahead and switch it up, and then we'll save the questions for discussion.
I'm up now, right?
Yep.
Okay.
And we've got 1 minute for people to filter in and out.
Okay, just let me know when to start then.
I think you can go ahead and get started, Jonathan.
Okay. So I'm Jonathan Kane at the University of Washington, and I'm going to be looking at fire-induced changes in forest structure by looking at mortality at a fine scale using pre- and post-fire lidar. This is aerial lidar. This is the there's a set of 4 fires that burned in Southwest Oregon in 2013, and sort of by happy coincidence, that area had just been flown with lidar the previous summer. And then, as is not too uncommon, they reflew this area immediately post-fire to like look for landslides and such. But a little bit more uncommon, 2 years later, they flew it again to do an extended assessment. And then 2 years after that, so 4 years post-fire, they flew it a 4th time. So we can actually do an extended assessment of these fires using aerial lidar alone, which is quite uncommon. And I recognize most fires will not have a data set like this. There will be an increasing number as more and more of the forested land in the country gets flown with LiDAR. The chance that a fire burns in a place that already has LiDAR will just go up and up and up. But most of the time when people are flying post-fire LiDAR, they're not doing an extended assessment, they're doing an immediate assessment, which for various reasons isn't so useful for the kinds of analyses I'm going to be presenting here. So what I wanted to do was to try and say, what kinds of patterns can we see in these fires that potentially you could take to other fires without, even if you don't have this same kind of data set. So I'm going to be trying to relate what we see in Landsat severity, which is available everywhere, into these kinds of products that I'm going to be showing that you won't really have for most fires. So real quick, I don't want to spend a lot of time here. This is what the ownership looks like for these fires. The blue is federal land, the red is private land. Pretty much the entirety of the private land was had a salvage harvest after the fire and is basically unusable because all we know is the trees are gone and we don't know which ones died and which ones got cut down while they were alive. So I'm going to be focusing exclusively on the federal land where I saw no evidence of post-fire salvage harvest. And just real quick, I don't want to spend too long on the methods, but LiDAR is capable of measuring near-infrared reflectance, which is a good measure of chlorophyll content, which itself correlates with whether or not a tree is alive or dead. And so we have about an 80% success rate at identifying overstory trees, overstory here meaning nothing between them and the airplane. So at the top, they could be a really short tree as long as there's nothing immediately above them. So we have about an 80% success rate at identifying overstory trees and about a 90% success rate at telling which ones are alive or dead using that near-infrared reflectance. And this is just to sort of demonstrate that this does seem to in fact work. Here's a transect pre and post fire. Pre-fire, you can see that these green spots are the spots with high near-infrared reflectance and thus presumably a lot of chlorophyll. And you can see in the post-fire, I picked a transect where the fire came right through the middle of it. And you can see the trees on the left retained their high reflectance, and the ones on the right have low reflectance, and thus we end up classifying them as dead. So this is going to be I'm going to be showing off all the various things I calculated on the same square over and over and over. So this is just a pre-fire shot of it. You can see it's very dense canopy. There's a few openings here or there. The brown on the right indicates where the openings are. The black here means live trees, and that's kind of a unusual color choice, but we're going to be interested in where the trees that die are. So the live canopy is sort of the background from the perspective of this study. So I colored it a background color. And the fire came through here and a lot of stuff died. The red here are the spots where we believe from the LiDAR data that the trees are dead. And then the brown are openings, some of which were there pre-fire and some of which were opened by the fire. And you can see this is a spot that has a nice mix of severities. Like this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this huge patch of mortality in the bottom right is high severity. We have some more moderate severity in like the top middle, maybe some low severity in the upper left, and then maybe some stuff that was completely unburned in the left middle. And also, just to sort of demonstrate to yourself that this does in fact seem to work, you can just take any spot like on the right where you see a mortality patch, and then just take a look at the same spot on the left. And there will pretty much always be something there. Maybe the shape is a little bit wrong, but by and large, just if you can trust your eyes, it does seem to be correctly measuring where the dead trees are. And so this is a very fine scale data set. The resolution is 3/4 of a meter, which is sort of hard to work with over a whole landscape scale. So we ended up summarizing up to the 30-meter scale. That also helps with the research question of given Landsat severity, what does this finer resolution see? So we aggregated it up to match the same resolution as the Landsat. And this on the right is just what percentage of this 30-meter pixel was dead according to our estimate of dead overstory trees. So we can see down here in the bottom right, we have close to 100% mortality. And then like the left middle, we have close to 0%. And then in the rest of the area, we have various numbers in between. And this is just a shot comparing this that measure to Landsat severity from MTBS. And you can see it does seem to be corresponding pretty well. The spots that are high mortality according to the lidar are high severity according to the Landsat. We have some spots where Landsat detected no change, and we're seeing close to 0% mortality in the lidar. And sort of in between moderate and low severity seem to be matching up pretty well as well. So real quick, one thing I wanted to do was sort of see whether DNBR and RDNBR were corresponding to this differently, because we do have multiple measures of Landsat fire severity out there. DNBR, RDNBR, RBR, there might be more I'm not even aware of. So my first thought was that since DNBR is just a raw measure of difference in reflectance, that it doesn't do any correction for the amount of vegetation that existed in the pixel ahead of time. So my first thought is it would correspond well to just what's the raw amount of stuff that died without correcting for the amount of vegetation ahead of time in the LiDAR. And I thought that since RDNBR is supposed to correct for that, it's supposed to account for what amount of vegetation existed in the pixel ahead of time, that it would better correspond to if I made that exact same correction in the LiDAR and asked what percentage of the vegetation died rather than what percentage of the pixel. So I did expect RDNBR to correlate better with that corrected form and for DNBR to sort of have a mushier relationship in general. But that's not what I found at all. I found that both DNBR and RDNBR correlated better with the corrected version, the version where you exclude areas that weren't vegetation ahead of time. But they actually correlated with it equally well. So at least in this little corner of Southwest Oregon with these specific 4 fires, measuring only canopy overstory mortality, RDNBR doesn't seem to be performing any better than DNBR, which was a surprising result to me. So to the extent that it's doing any better in general, it either doesn't apply in this region or is due to things that the LiDAR can't measure. So things other than overstory mortality. And this slide is just given and for that reason, I'm going to be proceeding with DNBR just because it's a simpler measure, and because also if you aren't putting a lot of work to get your own fire severity and you're just like downloading stuff off MTBS, MTBS provides classified DNBR but not classified RDNBR. So I'm going to be proceeding with DNBR for that reason. And this is just a graph of, given that MTBS classified the severity in a given way, what's the amount of mortality that we're actually seeing? So we can see if MTBS says no change detected, that probably truly does mean around 0% mortality. If it says high severity, that probably does mean truly close to 100% mortality and definitely above 80%. Low severity is, there's a decent amount of things that were classified as low severity that seem to be 0% mortality, but even accounting for that, it never goes up much above 30%. And the real interesting result, I think, is moderate severity can take on basically any value in terms of percentage mortality. It can go all the way from 0 up to 100. And I think that over the next few slides, I'll be able to pose some guesses for why that is. So this is another metric I calculated. On the left here, we just split, instead of looking at what percentage of a pixel died, I split the mortality patches up by how big they are, and just measured what's the dominant patch size in each pixel. So we can see that we go from things that are all the way up past a hectare to things that are down below 1% of a hectare. And we just plotting this against DNVR, we sort of have a nice log linear relationship. So between the logarithm of the dominant patch size and the DNVR, with this one little bit out here, which is spots that have moderate severity but low patch size, which I interpret to be spots that attain moderate severity by having a large number of small patches rather than by having medium-sized or larger patches. But other than that, for the most part, there is a log linear relationship going on here. And I'm running low on time, so I'm going to sort of zoom through. This is just what do we get using that same metric split up by severity. And for the most part, low severity is sticking to patches that are below 1/10 of a hectare. So that's right here where my cursor is, the 10 cubed. High severity is mostly sticking to spots that are larger, or patches that are larger than a hectare. That's at 10 to the 4th here. Moderate severity runs the full gamut. It can be a single medium-sized patch. It can be the edge of a large high severity patch, or it can be a larger number of small patches that would be low severity if they occurred by themselves. And speaking of number of patches, we can just straight up count that and then compare that to Landsat severity. So we can see that, for instance, high severity is pretty much always a single patch. That is just that big stick up where we have one patch in the pixel. Low severity is usually sticking to 1 to 3 with patches, and pretty much the only severity that gets 4 or more patches on a regular basis is moderate severity, which fits again with that story of there's multiple ways to get moderate severity. You can get moderate severity by having a single medium-sized patch, by being at the edge of a high severity patch, which is very large, but sort of cuts through the middle of the pixel. Or you can get it by having a larger number of smaller patches. And then the last thing I wanted to look at is, since we can track the fates of individual trees, individual overstory trees, we can just check, is there anything that corresponds to whether they live or die? And the thing that lidar is best at measuring is height, and that's tree size correlates reasonably well with age. So we just looked at, given a tree of a certain height, what is the chance that it survived? And we get this graph where up until about 10 or 15 meter tall trees, increasing size drastically increases its chance of survival. But past that, increasing the size really doesn't have that much of an effect. Like there is still a downward trend, but it really levels off at about 10 meters. And splitting it out by severity, we see that low and moderate severity both have this story where they kill a lot of the trees that are shorter than 10 meters. But as it increases up to that 10-meter size, trees rapidly become more resilient to mortality, but it eventually levels off. And the big exception is high severity, where everything dies. Though that's not really a surprise because that's the definition of high severity. If the tall trees were surviving, then it wouldn't be high severity. And high severity is occurring in places that don't have as many tall trees to begin with. which is what we can see in the red in the background. This is just a histogram of the pre-fire tree heights in the places that were high severity to begin with. And I am coming up on time, so I'll just end it there.
Alina, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry, folks.
Yeah, I was wondering where Alina's voice was.
Sorry, guys. I was just looking online for questions in the question and answer boxes for Jonathan. And Jonathan, I was going to say, if there's anything you need to conclude with, just to wrap up your presentation, you have a minute or two to do that.
Yeah, if there's no questions, I can spend my remaining 5 minutes talking. Yeah, so I would say the big takeaway is, well, first of all, this is only in a set of 4 fires in Southwest Oregon. And, you know, attempting to extrapolate to every fire in the world off of that is going to be foolish. But to the extent that these fires are representative, it does seem like, at least as far as top of canopy mortality goes, you're completely fine using DNBR. RDNBR doesn't seem to add anything, at least in these 4 fires and for top of canopy mortality. And it seemed no change detected, seems to be trustworthy. It usually really is unburned, 0% mortality. High severity also seems to be trustworthy. It really is 80% or more mortality. Low severity is usually a bunch of small, less than 1/10 of a hectare patches, 1 to 3 of them, and totaling up to less than 20%. It's a little less trustworthy, but it's still doing pretty well. And moderate severity is really the one where, if all you know about a spot is that Landsat says it's moderate severity, you don't really know very much. As far as I can tell, there's about 3 different kinds of moderate severity, and maybe further research can attempt to disentangle them using, I don't know, potentially other Landsat bands or something like that. But there's sort of the one where you're really at the edge of a high severity patch that just crosses through the middle of the pixel. There's the one where you have like 1 to 3 medium-sized patches, which can be thought of like as low severity but bigger. And then there's the one where it's like you have 4 or more small patches, which add up to moderate severity put together.
Excellent. Thanks, Jonathan. I have a question for you, and perhaps it's a leading question because I also work on post-fire tree mortality, but I am interested in whether you can switch some of those last relationships around and predict tree mortality based on the Landsat data, but do it for specific height classes using the lidar data.
Oh, so you're asking, like, if you hand me a DNBR value, could I guess at what the chance that trees in different heights died?
Yes.
I believe I could, though I suspect this is something that changes wildly with forest type and species composition, and lidar cannot measure species composition. So if you have a forest that is very similar to the forest these 4 fires burned in, then we could do it with this data set. For anything else, it would require new training data.
Excellent answer. Let me see. Go ahead,
Alina,
Susan.
is it okay if I chime in? So unfortunately, I missed the first part of your talk, Jonathan. But I was wondering, great job with what I caught, but I was wondering if you had considered using your LiDAR data to reclassify the bins, or were you taking standard bins for special moderate severity?
What I wanted to do for this particular presentation was notice that nobody's going to have this kind of data set that we have unless you're working with these 4 fires, or maybe there's a few other fires in the world that have a data set like this. So what I wanted to do is say, given that all you have is the Landsat data, what can you learn from that? So I didn't want to redefine the bins. I wanted to just use the products you could download straight off of MTBS. But that is a good idea, that this kind of data, where it exists, can be used to perhaps better define the bins, or there's even an idea of trying to tangle out those three different kinds of moderate severity by training a Landsat model to somehow distinguish between the three of them.
Yeah, I really like that idea. And the last follow-up question I had for you is, did you notice a more of a bias towards like higher DNVR values being, that were closer to high severity? Did you see more of a bias towards higher mortality in the moderate severity range or not?
Let me just go back to this slide, but
Okay,
it was
sorry about
close
this.
to equal probability. But moderate severity can really be anything with close to equal
Yeah.
probability. It's not a flat distribution, but it's pretty dang close.
There it is. Okay, thanks.
We have one suggestion in the chat from Steve Norman that it'd be you could use Sentinel-2 to map at 20-meter resolution,
Yep.
which would reduce the mixed pixel problem. Were these fires within the temporal range of the Sentinel-2 data?
I don't know off the top of my head. They burned in 2013, if anybody else
Okay,
wants
so
to answer
no.
that. I do agree that in general, Sentinel, all else being equal, is going to perform better just because of the better resolution. But again, I wanted to compare this to something that is easily available to anyone just clicking on the MTBS website.
Excellent. Well, folks, we're going to wrap up with Jonathan's talk and move to a group discussion to sort of tie off and bring together all the different speakers from the session. So I'm going to ask that if you were an organizer or a speaker of this session, that you go ahead and turn on your video and unmute your mic. And if you want to chime in and ask speakers questions, you can do that in the chat. What I'd like you, if you're a member of this audience, if you can go to the discussion that's listed from 12 to 12:40 and type it in the chat there, that would be the best place, but I'll try to monitor all the chats as we go into this discussion section. Turns out there's like 3 separate chats that could be applicable, so it's been a little bit of a challenge here.
Hi, my name is Tanya. I'm from the production team for the conference today. I'm jumping in as our producer for this session. Anthony is having some internet troubles. So I'm just wondering if Chris, trying to see your full name here.
Chris Moran.
Chris Moran, who's listed as host currently, if you could go ahead and make me a host or a co-host of this session, I can take over for Anthony. And then I'll go back behind the scenes. My name is Tanya, and if you hover over my name, you should be able to. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Got it. Okay, great.
Carry on.
Folks. Okay, and who have we got? So Jonathan, Susan, Eric, who else are we looking for? Let's see, a few people should trickle in here. Saba, we've got Gina, Nuria, Catherine. Okay, folks, I'm going to try to get us started with a question if we don't have a question directly from the audience. And I think, hang on, let me let Eric in from the waiting room. I think one thing that we wanted to do was bring people together who were using, new technology related to remote sensing. And we've had remote sensing from terrestrial platforms, from UAVs, from aerial, from space, and we've had detections from lidar, from photogrammetry, from heat sensors, and the thought that we can all learn from different scales and different data and their applications. So maybe just to get started, just to get the ball rolling with a talk, for each speaker, do you guys think you can contribute what you think the biggest sort of challenge that is difficult to address with the remote sensing data you guys are using that needs to be addressed for us to better understand fire regimes?
Yeah, great question. I'll take that first. Just as a reminder, my talk was, we're mainly looking at fuels, vegetation pre-fire, and then trying to relate that to thermal data. And a big issue for us initially was the co-registration. I think we've hit on that, is trying to match those pixels. Each set of data have their own sets of error, and they often don't co-vary. So, but the bigger issue is trying to account for the things that we can't measure out in the field, especially spatially. For us is the wind component. We can put out wind anemometers and try to get a general sense of what the winds are doing, but that's never going to match what was happening pixel for pixel as far as the fuels and the fire behavior. So trying to control for those variables that we can't measure. And we tried to isolate, in our study, try to isolate and use control pairing to account for that. But ultimately, we'll never really, I don't think, be able to fully measure the fire environment, and then in order to disentangle those fuel and fire relations.
I can also answer the question in terms of, just a reminder, I was talking about digital aerial photogrammetry that's coming from basically the NAPE program. And to answer, I think Erfan put a question in the chat of what software are you using. I believe that they are using the Socket software to process this data. And what I didn't talk about in this talk is that there have actually been multiple iterations of processing this data, like over and over, because basically if you put different, Caleb has been playing with putting different parameters within this software to just see like what's the best he can get out of it. So at least in the terms of this specific DAP product that we're talking about, it kind of feels like we're really in the early stages of figuring out, okay, the imagery is for ortho imagery and the software is for ground models, and we want to find out how we can monitor forests. So it's kind of like we're trying to take what's available and apply it to a question that we're interested in. And I think the biggest challenge is just that, trying to figure out where DAP works best and where we can confidently like do analyses, because there are definitely places where it just doesn't make sense to do so. And so I'm kind of, me and Van have talked about this, leaning towards producing basically like uncertainty layers or just uncertainty information so that users can know, all right, don't use it here, use it here. But on a deeper level, like the biggest issue that's coming with this data type is this whole issue of your spatial extent and your grain size, right? So like they're doing it across the whole state, but it's at a 40 centimeter resolution, and it's really only good at looking at the top of the canopy, versus people who are using drones across a plot can get a really good, idea of what's going on the ground. So I hope that kind of helps answer the question.
Really helpful. So I think like the common theme of challenges, both with just getting the technology to work for you and matching up data sets, as well as like what's the limit to what it can detect in applications. Eric?
Yeah, I think to follow up to what both Chris and Saba have mentioned is, we don't have centralized workflows on this scale of data. We're all using different applications. Some of it's homespun, some of it's, proprietary. And I think one of the key aspects that we need to address to start scaling and using these data for larger applications is to standardize how we're processing data, and preferably, the way I look at it is that, with things like Earth Engine or cloud-based, we're just uploading, and there's a centralized processing repository where people can add code and whatnot. But I think one of the biggest limitations that we run into is that, a great example is LAS tools. We use it a lot. Unfortunately, Martin passed away this year, and there's uncertainty about this whole line of processing tools that a lot of people have come to use, and how that goes forward. And I think, as we look forward to where these all are going. I mean, we've been working with this scale of data since the early 2000s. I mean, and what's remarkable to me is that here we are in 2021 and we haven't moved into that next step. And I think with artificial intelligence and kind of some of the things that are coming up with that, you know, there's this huge repository of data that could be used as labels that could answer to, I think, some of the questions that like Chris brought up. Yeah, we're never going to measure everything, but as we start getting a critical mass of information that's standard and usable, then maybe that starts getting us to interpreting or, you know, imputing what those missing elements are. And we just aren't there yet, but I think it's one of those things that would be really good to kind of coalesce and pursue.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I think everybody's been right on so far, but I also think that there's a temporal component that's hard to overcome, that we just only have so many years of high quality data, and we're just going to have to keep continuing on collecting. If we're talking about fire regimes, a lot of these are really long term, and we just don't have the years of information that we need to get really good detail about a lot of places. Like where I work in New South Wales, part of my limitation in my study was that I didn't have a good fire regime map for the state. And some people have teased apart maybe by vegetation type what they expect the fire history would have been based on ecological traits. You can get around it in sort of more natural history level stuff. And so it's really exciting to see some of the fire scar research that's coming out that can fill in the gaps in some of the information that we don't have yet. But the longer we keep collecting and the more high resolution, more years we have, the better this will go forward.
I just want to kind of echo what Eric was saying and what a few other folks were saying about kind of developing a consistent framework and kind of this standardized way of processing this data. So my talk was yesterday, and I covered the use of a GoPro as a way to collect close range photogrammetry or generate close range photogrammetry models as kind of this democratized open source way of generating point clouds. And, you know, in an ideal world, anyone can go out, buy a $250 or $300 GoPro, collect this information, and then process it themselves and have these point clouds that they can use and manipulate and analyze in something like Cloud Compare. But the reality is that the workflow that we have so far identified, you know, there's these intermediate steps where maybe anyone can collect that data, but then that data eventually has to go through, you know, a privatized expensive software such as Agisoft, which not everyone has access to. So I think kind of a major challenge to what I'm trying to do is create a fully open source, a fully publicly available, a fully free way of using this data and kind of being able to use it from start to finish and not just collect the data and then pass it off to someone who has a license for the software that you need to use to process it.
Airborne LiDAR has a bit of an advantage there because some of the best tools are free. Last Tools wasn't entirely free, but Fusion and the LiDAR package in R both were. But that's like what Saba was talking about with the DAP. We basically worked with Washington State DNR because it requires expertise and $10,000 software that is basically only available in that combination in one room in the entire state.
I'm going to suggest one other challenge, and part of maybe why we have fine resolution fuels folks in the room with larger scale folks. And it's that characterizing the surface fuels with the large scale data has been really challenging. And we got some examples of how people are doing that by modeling little fall, and also characterizing the traits of plants in a way related to their flammability, and then connecting that with larger scale data has also been challenging. So where do you guys see the connections between this fine scale data going to connect to the larger scale data? My impression is a lot of it is going to need to go through the intermediate step, like Nuria's presentation on litter fall dynamics of some sort of process modeling.
Yeah, I agree with that view. Like if we want to map like relatively those fine fuel at large spatial scales, we need to go to some mechanistic models, conceptual models that give us some sort of a in between. Because with the lidar, even with terrestrial lidar or those GoPros or like more high resolution data, you got sampling strategies at the end. You have points at different locations, but you don't have the representativity of all the sites. So at the end, you need like something in between. So I guess at the end, we don't need to forget about all those ecology concepts that we have that we need to apply in order to. And if already we know things like which kind of vegetation we do have, how it is, we might be able to better characterize all the process by also knowing climate and so on. So I guess there is opportunities. It's a really complex process. So it's probably difficult to put all of that together. But I mean, we are working on that.
Well, I'll bring up a problem that I've seen. I gave the general introduction, but I've been working with airborne LiDAR now for 13, 14 years. And one problem that I think we have is that we keep simplifying the data back off into just very, very simple measurements. And I don't think that we've really developed a landscape forest ecology or fire processes to really be able to exploit the data. So airborne LiDAR is a case where the methods are mature, but the theory, I don't believe, has caught up. And I believe that as people start mapping the fuels to start finding the same thing, although I was encouraged to see efforts like Russ Parsons where they're trying to take this data and fit it into physics models. But at the landscape scale, I think we still need to develop theory to go with this incredibly rich data source.
Susan, you just turned on your camera. Do you have a response?
Yeah, I'll just chime in because I think that, you know, for our 3D Fuels project, just in general, one of the things that we can do is start tagging our fuels that we've carefully characterized into types. And then we will be talking with some folks about providing our data sets for AI and having these be test data. And it would be really exciting to continue this discussion with this awesome session about how we can actually bring in a lot of data sets and have them standardized to be available for machine learning. So that's a big step before we can start doing predictive modeling of what those understory fuels are. Right now, when I look at computational fluid dynamics models, they're very capable of representing heterogeneous surface fuels, but they don't. There's generally a green slime approach to characterizing the understory fuels every single time.
I have an audience question from Efren Chowderhurry. I also see your mic's off, so feel free to turn on your video if you want and chime in and ask it directly, or I can read it. So I'll just go ahead and read this. This is to Gina. You mentioned Agisoft for creating point clouds, but have you looked into Open Drone Map or a FOSS solution?
Yeah. Also, everyone on my video is frozen. So can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. I was worried I was going to get kicked off. Yeah, so I have not dived that deeply into open source photogrammetry software yet. So that's really good to know that those two are out there. I think by the time I started really exploring other options, I was so deep in processing everything in Agisoft that it seemed like moving forward with Agisoft was my best option, and then I could go back later, but I will definitely take notes of those. So thank you.
And I'm also going to suggest that anyone else in the audience who wants to directly ask a question, go ahead and do that. You can just turn off your mic and ask, which I believe is possible, or turn on your mic, which I believe is possible to do. Maybe I'm mistaken, or type it into the chat.
That is correct. Anyone should be able to unmute.
Come on, guys, don't be shy.
I have a question actually for Saba or anyone familiar with digital aerial photogrammetry. So Saba, you were mentioning that the digital aerial photogrammetry doesn't perform as well in low canopy cover because it has this tendency to take, individual or smaller clumps of trees and kind of drag them down. So I was wondering if you knew or could talk a little bit about what, if any, options exist for someone who might want to use digital aerial photogrammetry in maybe more of like a moderate canopy cover situation, where maybe it's in that gray area where they're not sure if it's appropriate or if it's too low of canopy cover to use. What options exist for them to kind of validate that data without actually having airborne lidar?
That's funny that you asked that, because I'm about to embark on a journey of validating that data with airborne lidar data, where I have, lidar throughout the Colville, and I was going to break up the lidar data into different canopy cover bins and just check and see like what are the pairwise comparisons. I mean, if you don't have access to lidar, you might it'd be nice to have field data, right? Like you need to have some kind of truth. I don't think I would feel comfortable using DAP without, truth, that's either from literally the ground or lidar. One thing that Astrid in our lab did just to kind of get at credible change areas was use the Forest Service LCMS, which I constantly forget what it stands for, but it's like change areas. So kind of like if you have confidence in a place in a static data set that you don't think should have changed, and you have this post that time photogrammetry, you could maybe use that as a place to check. But right now I am definitely in that process of kind of sussing out, in this moderate space, what are the uncertainty bounds of that. But Van, if you want to add anything to that, go for it.
I think you did a good job, Sal.
Cool. Yeah, it's hard.
So is everything going to have to, at what extent are we going to have to be able to, or what's the pathway, I guess, to not have to do regional calibration for everything? Certainly for modeling surface fuels, there would need to be, or for getting it from larger scale data, there's a lot of downscaling that needs to happen. And I think the same goes for a lot of the 3D photogrammetry. You may have to develop those relationships for every, will you have to develop them for every species, or are we going to be able to find some universal rules on the best approach that then can be transferred from different ecosystems?
Eric, do you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we've been talking a lot about this because, the work that Nuria has been doing with the simulation of the needle cast, I think, and what Michelle Bester did with her quantitative structural modeling, my question is that, is remote sensing the end result where we're using it to quantify and build the products, or is it maybe something that's more in a simulation space? We've played a lot around with building plant models and whatnot, and I think you could probably build a physical model. One idea that we had that came out of one of the projects we did was we did a similar thing to what Nuria is doing, which was that we had photorealistic trees, and we seeded the trees with physical models of needles, and then we used the physics engines in Blender plus the collision detection and added in a little bit of wind, and we were able to drop the needles down, have them get perturbed. And so the question, I guess, is that we look at it from regional calibration, but the other idea would be that we start taking kind of the results that we find from these studies and start parameterizing physical models of the way plants operate, and then use that maybe as the way to represent surface fuels, for instance, because the variability is off the charts. We're finding this with the 3D fuels that, if every time we go to a new place that we're taking some new recipe of variables, it's not really an effective way to model it or to predict it. And I think there's other ways that we can do it, that remote sensing is maybe the framework that we start applying these ideas to, and then we start, a large simulation process, which, is functionally what we do with everything like from land fire, all the stuff that we use. And then we can scale that to any range of scales that we want. It could be leaf scale or it could be stand scale.
Alina, I'll chime in from there and just say that I'm really excited about having that common repository. Another person that has been in conversation with us around that is Kevin Hires, and he's now working kind of tall timbers, but has shifted over to USGS. So I think that be good for all of us to consider these fuel repositories with test data sets for AI, but also the data that can inform this synthetic fuel, kind of probabilistic fuel mapping that Eric's talking about.
Excellent. I'm going to open this up for additional audience and panelist discussion and questions, but I also don't want to keep people longer than needed, and maybe these discussions can continue online. So I'll just let it go from here, and then if we realize we want to go on to another session or give ourselves a slightly longer break, that's just fine as well.
Yeah, I had a question. So Susan and Eric, you guys mentioned the AI and the repository of 3D data. Can you expand a little bit on what you're thinking as far as what the AI models are going to predict and the kind of end result of what comes out of those?
Do you want to go first, Eric?
No, you can start off, Susan.
Well, I would really love for first of all, to have a library of fuel bed properties that can be used to think through a generic, say if we were in the Southeast, a longleaf pine savanna. And basically, if we know where the existing trees are, that's great. And perhaps we can use some litter deposition modeling. But for those understory fuels, couldn't we work with existing data sets to, this is an Eric Roll idea, so I'm totally stealing it right now, but inform probability distributions of cover and height of major shrubs or wiregrass to basically predictively distribute understory vegetation rather than just have a homogeneous fuel bed that's often used right now. Go, Eric.
Yeah, I guess to follow up, I mean, so I've got a couple projects that we're working with AI to, do rapid updates for, land fire. And what we've found is that there's just not enough training data. There's not enough labels that we can gain access to. And when I talk to the collaborators who are working on it, I mean, we put in, petitions and proposals to FIA to get some of those data. But what we need is like 10s, 20, 30,000 observations to be able to adequately engage with the machine learning. And I think that that's what, the way we look at it is that, we have these limited scale data sets. And I mean, the 3D fuels is a really robust data set. It's going to have a lot of impact over time, but then that also requires something like that detail to be adopted by an agency or someone where we start getting huge amounts of data. And, so that's kind of where the idea that, Luke Wallace and Sam Hillman down in Australia, when they kind of first published on like using the in situ photogrammetry from cell phones, I've talked a bit about it with them. That's the idea of like, we need a way to get a huge amount of labels to meaningfully, start estimating things with AI. And right now we're in this early phase because there isn't a data set like that. And so when I think about it, Chris, I think about the fact that we need to it could be a combination of the BLK that they're doing in the Southeast with Fish and Wildlife Service. It could be the GoPro. I know that there's like 1,200 sites in the Sierra Nevada through a CAL FIRE proposal that have had like regal data collected. But these are all one-off. At some point, we need to like coalesce these data sets, because that's when we get to the 20 or 30,000 labels that we need to start making those kinds of advancements in the AI. But and I think even from that standpoint, there's all of these different groups who are engaging in AI. But once again, at some point there needs to be a coalescence of all of these people together with at least some consolidated framework that allows us to leverage all of these data sets that are being collected nationally, regionally, and then the people who are developing those kind of workflows with AI that and machine learning that help then make rapidly updated fuels maps, or for understory fuels, or even integrating the stuff that Karen Riley's done with NAPE, or the stuff that you guys are using for airborne or drone-based thermal infrared. Because I mean, like, one of the things that we were looking at was that Courtney Intelligence for CAL FIRE has been collecting like 20-minute to 45-minute intervals of thermal infrared on some incidents in California, and it's amazing to see the difference, to look at like the way that fire spreads through a system, especially with the Dixie Fire or the Caldor, and integrating things like that. And then you can like have your UAS doing more of an in situ fine scale, but then using that as an AI to start looking at like, what are the spread rates? What's the thermal flux? I mean, there's a lot of opportunity with it. It just requires, I think, us as a discipline to start coalescing and, working on some like bigger initiatives about how do we integrate these things.
A follow-up question to that, Eric. And this is because I know your dissertation, but have you thought about creating synthetic landscapes that could serve as training data that come with labels?
Yeah, that's absolutely the path we're going down right now. And I think that's, I mean, yeah, I think, there's so much advancement. I mean, you look at what Russ has been doing with the QSN and what Michelle's doing. I mean, and, in Europe, like Matt Disney, he's been doing this for years. And I think that's really where it comes, is that, in that particular instance of that chapter in my dissertation, it took 9 plant models to be able to adequately predict out, the fuels we saw in Eglin Air Force Base. And, it's kind of, you build the fuel, the like model of the plant, and then it's really about scaling. And that's where the remote sensing comes in. Because if you have this terrestrial laser data that we have, like for the 3D fuels, where you have a 200 by 200 meter synoptic view, the thing that we're really getting great is the shrubs. And you have all of your scaling factors to replicate, 4 or 5 plant models throughout this 200 by 200 meter landscape that have already been shown to do probably a better job of predicting out what the fuels are, the surface area, like things like leaf area index, or a whole litany of things that you'd want to be able to measure. And then you have the trees as well. And then that's where you just start doing these like physical models of like deposition, because like in these frequently burned systems, I think needle cast and like deciduous litter cast is really pretty easy in the Southeast. I mean, it's very predictable based off of climate, and that things are being burned every 1 to 2 years, and that should be an easy way. The West is going to be the hard part, and I still don't have a good answer for Duff. Duff is going to be the thing that just messes up this whole model, because you look at any prescribed fire in the West, and it's really variable how it's burning when they're doing the actual ignition operations, and then watching it chunk through Duff for like 3 to 4 more weeks until the end of season event happens. I mean, how do you characterize that disturbance, and how Duff's impact in terms of prescribed fire and even wildland fire is? I mean, that's a really hard question.
Yeah. And I think you're still having a US centric view, because anyone who worked in Northern Canada would say, well, yeah, and also smoldering combustion in permafrost layers. But I think just to add on, like there's a view of this as like going into the fluid dynamics models, but having worked on some other like big data initiatives with the tree mortality stuff, this is also a move towards big data and machine learning and simulation through data aggregation. And I kind of see some of the stuff that's been done with like the International Plant Traits Database as being a pretty similar, and maybe even overlapping in some cases with what we're thinking about in terms of fuel properties databases. So that can maybe serve as a good model, although the types of data are different. It's not a list of traits, it's a set of remote sensing data sets. And so thinking about how as we move on in fire science, like how we're using aggregations of large data to answer questions, right? But so many of these have been ad hoc collections that we're bringing together. And what really seems to be missing is like the initiative to do it in a systematic manner to directly address gaps. So, and like maybe that's what the land fire program did at one point, right? So this has been done in other areas in the past, but we're at a horizon where maybe we could do that again.
Alina, I will say that you shared the International Plant Traits data, kind of the fields with us as we were trying to figure out how to type the field types. And you figure that that's not that hard, right? But we actually really struggled with thinking about common field types that were not species specific that could be used in 3D Fuels has Western ponderosa pine sites, Western grasslands, and then Southeast pine sites. So that's certainly not comprehensive of North America, but it was a good start for us to think through common field types that would be well represented out everywhere. So we have a start at that, and I'd be happy to share with others, but that's what we're kind of envisioning in terms of this repository, is having some data standards and tags that we can all use and agree on. We might not be there, but I actually think we're kind of close.
Well, folks, we've got 3 more minutes. So is there any wrap up that anyone wants to do before we take off and get a break?
I think this was a great session, Alina and Dan. Thanks for facilitating this and putting it together. I think it was great to see the things that people brought to the table, and especially at the scales we're working at. And it doesn't occur very often. And so I very much appreciate the fact that you pulled this together.
Yeah. I mean, I wish we could all go out for a beer and chit chat afterwards. And there's just something that's lost with not being in like the casual conversation and drawing on napkins that happens is just not the same, right? And so hopefully we'll get there at some point in the future at some field location. That's great. I want to thank all of our speakers and all of our audience members for their participation in this session. And hopefully people who were not able to make it are also able to view the recorded version of this and learn from it after. So maybe that's one silver lining as well. And I'll wrap it up with that. Anthony, do you have any?
I will make one final comment, which is one, the only way we're going to ever catch up on this conference is through the recordings. But I really want to acknowledge that Alina did all of the heavy lifting to organize this session, and she did just an outstanding job. So thank you, Alina.
You're welcome. And thanks for everyone for being here. And thanks, Anthony, for the really smooth production. We really appreciated that as well.
I was happy to help. We covered a lot of the things I was going to say, which is thank you, everyone, really, for being here. Thank you for our speakers. As is already stated, this recording will be available as a session in Hoover, our conference app, within 2 weeks of the Congress end. So that is going to be available. Please encourage people to watch. Up next, starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, is our afternoon plenary featuring keynote speaker Kevin Hires, wildland fire scientist of Tall Timbers Research Station, and Sally Archibald, University of University of Witwatersrand, professor at the School of Animal, Plant, and Environmental Science. We will also announce the winner of the AFE Lifetime Achievement Awards. So you're going to want to tune in for that. To access this session, use the agenda tab to the left of your screen and click sessions and click the main session titled to join. Thank you again to all our speakers. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. See you soon.
Thank you.